Hello friends, welcome aboard the Sleepy Fairy Tale Express. I'm the Red Mermaid. This train is a dream journey to fairy tale land. Have you all got your train tickets? Subscribe and hit the like button to always be able to ride. Close your eyes, prick up your ears, and listen in a comfortable position. Today's story is Snow White. The cold air of midwinter was swirling around the castle. The castle embraced the winter's chill, with white snowflakes fluttering past the windows, shining like carved crystals. Inside the castle, everything was quiet and calm. The world outside the window was covered in a blanket of white snow, and the snowflakes danced in the wind. By the window, the queen sat, leaning against a beautiful ebony frame. She was diligently focused on her embroidery, creating beautiful patterns with each delicate stitch. The queen occasionally looked out at the falling snow. The sight of each snowflake shining like a crystal was truly beautiful. As she watched the snow, she continued to move her knitting needle. Suddenly, she pricked her finger. "Ouch!" she exclaimed softly. 3 drops of blood fell from her finger, dropping onto the snow outside, spreading like red roses. As the queen watched the blood spread on the snow, she thought deeply. Seeing the white snow and red blood together, she made a heartfelt wish. If only I could have a child as white as snow and as red as blood. It seemed as though her wish reached the heavens at that very moment, blending with the white snow and red blood. The sight of the mingling blood and snow deeply moved the queen. She looked out the window and wished deeply in her heart. How wonderful it would be to have a child as white as snow and as red as blood. She sincerely made her wish. At that moment, a warm feeling spread through her heart, and she felt a sense of certainty that her wish would come true. Time passed, and finally, the queen's wish came true. The queen gave birth to a beautiful baby. The baby had skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. This baby was just as the queen had dreamt. The queen and the king named the baby Snow White. Snow White was blessed with perfect beauty, skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black and beautiful as ebony. From the moment she was born, Snow White brought great joy to the entire kingdom. Everyone admired Snow White's beauty and purity and came to love her. The birth of Snow White brought immense joy to the queen as well. She was extremely happy to see her wish come true. The queen always smiled happily as she looked at Snow White, loving her beauty even more. Snow White became a precious jewel of the kingdom, and her birth filled the entire kingdom with joy. However, this joy did not last long. Soon after Snow White came into the world, the queen fell ill with an unknown sickness and passed away. The queen grew weaker day by day and eventually could not recover. Her death brought great sorrow to the royal family. The castle was filled with silence and sadness, and the faces of all the people were marked by deep sorrow. The queen's death was tragic. She had rejoiced and loved Snow White's birth more than anyone, making her death even more sorrowful. Yet, Snow White, whom the queen left behind, became a light of hope for the entire kingdom, gradually illuminating their grief. This beautiful baby grew up as the kingdom's treasure, bringing comfort to the people. Although Snow White was still young, her pure eyes and innocent laughter provided great solace to everyone in the castle. The people of the kingdom felt new hope when they saw Snow White. The queen's death was a great pain, but Snow White's presence slowly healed that pain. Snow White became the new hope of the kingdom, signaling the beginning of a new legend. Everyone cherished and loved Snow White, and she grew up to be the brightest jewel of the kingdom. Snow White was loved not only for her beauty, but also for her warm heart. She was kind and gentle to everyone, like an angel descended to earth. The entire kingdom cherished and protected Snow White, watching her grow up. Snow White was the queen's last gift, and her presence brought new hope and joy to the kingdom. Time in the castle passed by indifferently for everyone. Even in the castle, filled with sorrow from the queen's death, time did not stop. After a year of mourning, the king decided to marry a new queen. He thought it was necessary to find happiness again for the sake of the kingdom and its people. The new queen was incredibly beautiful. Her beauty was so remarkable that it was known throughout the kingdom. However, deep in her heart, there was pride and arrogance that could not tolerate others. She took great pride in her beauty, but often looked down on others because of her excessive self-confidence. Because of this nature, she could not stand the thought of anyone being more beautiful than herself. She never tolerated anyone surpassing her beauty and always wanted to confirm that she was the best. The queen valued not only her external beauty, but also the power it brought. There was always a strong desire within her to overwhelm others. The queen's most prized possession was her mirror. This mirror had magical abilities beyond mere reflection. It was surrounded by a magnificent golden frame, and its surface was always clean and shiny, giving it a mysterious aura as if it were alive. Every morning and evening, the queen would stand before the mirror and gaze at her reflection. To confirm her beauty, she would ask the mirror, her voice ringing with command, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" Her voice was always full of confidence and expectation. The mirror always gave the same reply: "Queen, you are the fairest in the land." Hearing this, the queen would smile with satisfaction. She never doubted the mirror's words. The mirror's answer boosted her confidence and solidified her belief in her beauty. This mirror was more than just a mirror. It played a crucial role in soothing the queen's deep insecurities and arrogance. The mirror gave the queen assurance that she was the fairest in the land, helping her maintain her confidence. Standing before the mirror, the queen felt as though she possessed all the beauty in the world. The queen valued this mirror greatly. It was the only entity that knew her secrets and was her most faithful companion. Because the mirror always spoke the truth, the queen trusted its words. Thanks to this mirror, the queen could daily reaffirm her belief that she was the fairest in the land. The queen felt great satisfaction each time the magic mirror answered her. She never doubted the truth of the mirror's words. She firmly believed this truth, which further boosted her confidence. The queen took immense pride in being the fairest in the land, and this pride made her power even stronger. The mirror did more than just reflect the queen's appearance. It played an essential role in soothing her deep insecurities and arrogance. Standing before the mirror, the queen could always confirm her beauty and perfection. The mirror assured her that she was superior to all the women in the kingdom, giving her great comfort and strength. The queen felt more noble and unique thanks to the mirror's words. She felt like she was at the center of the world when she stood before the mirror, overflowing with confidence. The queen's beauty became a symbol of her power and status, going beyond mere physical appearance. Every morning, the queen stood before the mirror, feeling immense satisfaction. The mirror's answer gave her the strength to start her day, and further solidified her belief in her beauty. She took pride in being the fairest woman in the land, firmly believing she was the center of the world. Life inside the castle was always filled with new discoveries for Snow White. The castle was vast and splendid, with wonderful and beautiful things everywhere. Snow White delighted in discovering something new each day. Finding hidden treasures in each room of the castle felt like an adventure. As time passed, Snow White's beauty began to shine even more. Her skin was as white and clear as freshly fallen snow in winter. It was as if snowflakes had melted into her skin, making it pure and delicate. Snow White's lips were as red as the petals of a freshly bloomed rose. Her red and beautiful lips lit up the surroundings every time she smiled. Snow White's hair was as black and shiny as the deep night sky. Her hair sparkled in the sunlight, enhancing her elegance. Every time she brushed her hair, it shone brilliantly. The people in the castle admired Snow White's beauty every day. Whenever she walked through the castle, they couldn't take their eyes off her. Snow White was loved not only for her outward beauty, but also for her kind heart. Her presence brought a warm light to the castle, and everyone sincerely cherished and loved her. Every morning, the palace maids asked Snow White what she wanted to do. Her happiness was everyone's happiness, and they wanted her days to be filled with joy. The maids were always ready to do whatever Snow White desired. Snow White preferred the peace of nature over the splendid life of the palace. While she liked the grand and beautiful palace, she loved the freedom and tranquility she felt in nature even more. So, Snow White often spent her time in the garden filled with blooming flowers. The garden was a beautiful place where various flowers bloomed in each season. In spring, there were tulips and daffodils; in summer, roses and lilies; in autumn, chrysanthemums and sunflowers; and in winter, snow flowers bloomed. Snow White felt at peace as she admired the different flowers in the garden. The maids always made sure the garden was ready for Snow White. They tended the flowers for her, keeping the garden clean and beautiful. Snow White enjoyed her time in the garden, listening to the birds chirping and smelling the flowers, finding great happiness. The time spent in the garden brought great joy to Snow White. She played freely in nature, enjoying her freedom. In the garden full of blooming flowers, Snow White spent peaceful time, always with a happy smile on her face. One particular day, Snow White was walking among the colorful flowers, singing a beautiful song. Her pure and clear voice echoed through the garden. Snow White's beautiful voice reached all the living creatures in the garden, attracting the little birds around her. The birds gathered around, drawn by her singing. Snow White, delighted to see the birds gathering, said, "Friends, let's sing together." She started singing with the birds. The little birds chirped in response to Snow White's song, creating a beautiful harmony together. Their song resonated throughout the garden, making it peaceful and beautiful like a scene from a fairy tale. Snow White strolled among the flowers, singing and mingling with the birds. Her voice, combined with the scent of the flowers, sounded even more clear and beautiful. The birds perched on her shoulders and fingers, chirping, enjoying their time with Snow White. The scene was so beautiful it felt like time had stopped. Snow White singing with the birds lit up the garden, and everything blended peacefully and harmoniously. Snow White spent a happy time with her friends in nature, creating precious memories that would stay with her forever. Snow White's inner beauty was as dazzling as her appearance. She always wore a bright smile and treated everyone with warmth. Snow White was always kind to the maids, gardeners, cooks, and even the guards of the castle. She spoke kindly to everyone and offered help whenever needed. Seeing the maids working hard, Snow White would often approach them. "Let me help you," she would say, sharing their tasks. The maids were touched by Snow White's help and respected her even more. Snow White treated everyone in the castle like friends. She enjoyed gardening with the gardeners, chatting with them, and spending joyful moments cooking with the cooks. Snow White remembered everyone's names, listened to their stories, and showed genuine interest. Her kindness brought great comfort to everyone in the castle. Whenever someone looked sad, Snow White would approach them with comforting words and small gifts to lift their spirits. Her warm heart made everyone in the castle happy, and they all came to love her. Snow White's beauty was not just skin deep. Her inner light shone even brighter, making people love her even more. Snow White's kindness and warmth deeply moved everyone in the castle, making her the most beloved person in the kingdom. The queen once again stood before the mirror and asked her question. She sought the mirror's answer, as it always brought her great satisfaction and confidence. The queen wanted reassurance that she was the fairest in the land. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? She commanded. Her voice was still authoritative. The queen believed the mirror would again affirm that she was the fairest. She looked at the mirror with a satisfied smile. But today, the mirror's answer was unexpected. The mirror paused for a moment, then spoke words the queen had never anticipated. "Queen, you are beautiful, but Snow White is the fairest of them all." This was the first time the mirror had given a different answer. The queen, unable to believe what she heard, asked again, "What do you mean? Is that true?" Her voice trembled with unease and doubt. The queen thought the mirror must have made a mistake. The mirror, which had always assured her of her beauty, now claimed Snow White was fairer. Her heart was filled with anxiety and suspicion. "Do you truly mean Snow White is more beautiful than me?" The queen asked again, wanting to believe the mirror was wrong. "Yes, Queen. It is true. Snow White is the fairest of them all." The mirror's answer was firm. Hearing this, the queen's face flushed with anger. Her pride, built on being the fairest for so long, was deeply wounded. She stood frozen before the mirror. The queen's heart was now filled with rage and jealousy. She couldn't accept that Snow White was more beautiful than her. Staring at the mirror, she whispered, "Snow White is fairer than me? That is unacceptable." Her anger grew stronger. Jealousy consumed her, and her heart was filled with malice. She could no longer tolerate Snow White's beauty. From this moment, the queen's thoughts focused solely on how to eliminate Snow White. She began to devise an evil plan to get rid of Snow White. Each day, she stood before the mirror, nurturing her jealousy as she thought about Snow White's beauty. Her eyes turned cold, and her heart was filled with malice. The queen's heart was full of anger and jealousy, her face flushed with envy. Every time she saw Snow White, her anger boiled. The feeling grew stronger each day. She couldn't suppress her jealousy and anger when she saw Snow White's happy face. Her pride and arrogance filled her heart, spreading like poison. The queen grew to hate Snow White more and more, unable to bear her beauty. Seeing Snow White happily living in the castle only intensified the queen's jealousy. The queen felt she could no longer endure these feelings. Her mind constantly thought of ways to eliminate Snow White, growing more wicked. She eventually decided that she could not find peace unless Snow White was gone. The queen secretly summoned a trusted huntsman. Known for his strength and bravery, the queen trusted him. Kneeling before her, awaiting her command, the queen spoke coldly. "Take Snow White into the forest and kill her. Bring me her lungs and liver as proof." The queen gave the huntsman her final order. She wanted undeniable evidence of Snow White's death. The huntsman was to take Snow White into the forest and fulfill the queen's command. The queen trusted the huntsman. He was strong and loyal, and she believed he would carry out her order. The huntsman was shocked and terrified by the queen's order. He cared deeply for Snow White and knew she was the kingdom's pure treasure. Snow White was kind and loving to everyone. The thought of harming her pained the huntsman's heart. With a trembling voice, he said, "But Queen, Snow White is the treasure of our kingdom. How could I?" His voice was filled with fear and sorrow. He couldn't bear the thought of harming Snow White. The queen cut off the huntsman's words coldly, shouting, "If you do not follow my orders, you will face death." Her voice was cold and firm. Her gaze was threatening, and the huntsman froze in fear. The huntsman's heart felt like it was freezing over. His mind was filled with fear and anxiety. The queen's threat felt very real, and the huntsman realized his life was in danger. He wanted to protect Snow White, but he felt the pressing reality that he couldn't disobey the queen's order. Lowering his head, the huntsman replied in a small voice, "Yes, Your Majesty." His voice was weak, and deep within, he felt a struggle brewing. He didn't want to harm Snow White but felt compelled to follow the queen's order. Satisfied with the huntsman's answer, the queen nodded. With a cold smile, she gave him the final command. "Then go and carry out my order. Bring me her lungs and liver as proof." The queen spoke in a ruthless voice. The huntsman, with a heavy sigh, stepped back from the queen. He was burdened by the thought of taking Snow White into the forest. Inside, he struggled with his desire to protect her and the reality of having to follow the queen's order. With a heavy heart and burdened by anguish, the huntsman had no choice but to take Snow White into the forest. Knowing her pure and warm heart, making the decision was even harder. Snow White was kind and loving to everyone. The thought of harming her tore at the huntsman's heart. As they walked through the forest, Snow White asked the huntsman about its beauty, asking many questions with her joyful voice. "Huntsman, that tree is so tall. What is that flower called?" She was enchanted by the wonders of the forest, everything new and fascinating to her. The huntsman, answering her questions, felt deep conflict and anguish inside. Her innocent demeanor made him even sadder. "That is a pine tree, Snow White. And that flower is a daisy." He answered as calmly as possible, but his heart was heavy. Snow White asked about the small creatures in the forest, chatting happily. "There's a squirrel. It's so cute. That butterfly has such beautiful colors." Her face was filled with smiles, and her eyes sparkled with curiosity. Seeing Snow White's joy made the huntsman even more sorrowful. The huntsman was deeply conflicted. "How can I harm such a pure and beautiful child?" he whispered, lost in his confused thoughts. Snow White's innocent face and bright laughter pained his heart even more. He continued to walk, trying to suppress the anguish rising within him. Finally, when they reached the depths of the forest, the huntsman made a crucial decision. He realized he could no longer follow the queen's order. "Snow White, the queen ordered me to kill you." Snow White was shocked by his words. "Really? The queen ordered my death?" "Yes, but I cannot harm you." Tears of relief filled Snow White's eyes. "Really? You won't hurt me?" she asked cautiously. The huntsman nodded and approached her gently. "You are too pure and beautiful. I cannot harm you. You must stay safe in this forest," the huntsman said softly. Snow White, grateful for his decision, grabbed his hand in thanks. The huntsman released Snow White and helped her escape safely. He told her how to survive in the forest and encouraged her. "Follow this path, and you will find a small house. You can stay there safely," he said gently, reassuring Snow White. Snow White nodded gratefully. "Thank you, huntsman. I will never forget your kindness." With tears in her eyes, she looked at him. The huntsman hugged her warmly and said his final goodbye. "Goodbye, Snow White. Stay safe." After Snow White disappeared, the huntsman thought about how to deceive the queen. He realized he had to lie to the queen to save Snow White. So, he wandered through the forest, thinking about how to fool the queen. Soon, the huntsman found a young boar. He hunted it and cut out its lungs and liver. "I'll take these to the queen and make her believe they are Snow White's," he muttered to himself as he carried out his plan. The huntsman brought the boar's lungs and liver to the queen as proof. "Your Majesty, here are Snow White's lungs and liver." He spoke calmly, handing over the evidence to the queen. The queen, satisfied with the huntsman's words, nodded in approval. She believed Snow White was no longer a threat and felt pleased. The huntsman presented the organs to the queen. Seeing them, the queen smiled with satisfaction. "At last, Snow White is gone," she whispered joyfully. She handed the organs to the cook and ordered, "Boil these in salt water and bring them to me." The cook followed the queen's orders without question, boiling the organs in salt water. While they cooked, the queen felt satisfied, thinking Snow White was no longer a threat. When the organs were ready, the cook brought them to the queen. Believing they were Snow White's lungs and liver, the queen ate them. As she ate, she regained her confidence in being the fairest in the land. "Now I can finally be at peace," the queen thought. However, the queen had no idea she had been deceived by the huntsman. He sighed with relief, knowing he had saved Snow White and tricked the queen. Snow White ventured deeper into the dark forest, feeling surrounded by unfamiliarity and fear. The forest was dense with trees and vines, and she had no idea where to go. To calm her anxious heart, Snow White took a deep breath and quickened her pace. The forest presented many dangers. She heard the distant cries of various animals, the howls of wolves, the hoots of owls, and the sound of branches swaying in the wind, all of which heightened her anxiety. Despite her fear, Snow White kept moving forward. The shadows cast by the moonlight through the trees added to her sense of dread, making it seem as though something might be lurking in the darkness. The faint moonlight that filtered through the leaves lit her path, but the shadows appeared to move like living creatures. Snow White cautiously walked, her heart filled with fear and uncertainty. Snow White continued walking through the forest, always on alert. Her steps grew more careful, and she often stopped at the slightest sound. Time in the unfamiliar forest filled her with endless anxiety and fear, but she did not give up. Snow White was scared and unsure how to survive in this place. She started running aimlessly. The forest was deep and dark, and her heart was filled with fear. Snow White thought only of escaping quickly, so she kept running. During her escape, she tripped over sharp rocks and fell. Her knees and hands got scraped, and she bled, but Snow White didn't stop. She pushed through thorn bushes, tearing her clothes. Her dress was ripped in several places, and her skin was scratched by thorns. But Snow White endured the pain and kept moving forward. Hunger and exhaustion weighed her down. Snow White hadn't eaten all day, and as she kept running, she grew more and more tired. However, she couldn't give up. She had to keep moving to escape the queen's pursuit and the threats of the forest. As Snow White walked along a forest path, she discovered a small, charming house. This tiny house was hidden in the forest, looking like it came straight out of a fairy tale. Snow White looked at it with amazement and curiosity. The house was covered in moss and trees, with a small chimney puffing out smoke into the blue sky. Small flowers bloomed around the house, giving it a cozy atmosphere. Snow White wondered who lived in the house. She approached cautiously and knocked on the door. But there was no answer. Gathering her courage, Snow White decided to open the door. "Is anyone there?" she asked softly as she pushed the door open. Inside, the house was cozy and tidy. Everything was small and cute. On a small table covered with a white tablecloth, there were 7 little plates and 7 little cups. Along the wall were 7 small beds, each covered with white bedspreads. Snow White looked around in awe. "Such a tiny house, it's like little people live here," she murmured to herself. Everything inside was clean and well organized, exuding a warm atmosphere. Although everything inside was small, it was so cute and clean that she couldn't complain. On the table covered with a white tablecloth were 7 little plates, each with a little spoon beside it, spaced neatly with a small knife and fork, and 7 little cups. It looked like a dollhouse, charming and lovely. Along the wall were 7 little beds lined up. The beds were covered with white bedspreads, and each bed looked clean and cozy. Snow White was very hungry and thirsty, but didn't want to eat an entire meal meant for someone else. So, she took a little bit of vegetables and bread from each plate and a sip of wine from each cup. After eating and drinking, she felt very tired. Snow White tried to lie down on one of the small beds, but none of them fit her. One bed was too long, and another was too short. She tried several beds until she finally found that the 7th bed fit her. The bed was small but very cozy. Soon, Snow White fell into a deep sleep. The relief of finding a safe place away from the forest's dangers made her feel comfortable. Lying in the bed, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It had been such a fearful and exhausting day, but in the small house in the forest, she forgot her fears and slept peacefully. Snow White curled up under the warm blanket and fell into a deep sleep. She could momentarily forget all the hardships and fears she had experienced in the forest. The cozy and warm atmosphere of the small house embraced her, bringing her peace. As the sun set and the forest grew darker, the forest became quiet, with only the faint moonlight shining through. At that moment, footsteps were heard approaching the house. The 7 dwarfs were returning home, tired from a long day of working in the mines. Each dwarf carried a small lamp, and the tiny lights illuminated the dark forest. The light from the lamps lit up their faces, and though they were tired, they smiled and chatted with each other. "Today was a long day," one dwarf said. "But we can rest once we get home," another dwarf replied. When they arrived at the house, the dwarf sensed something unusual. The atmosphere inside the house felt different. As they opened the door and stepped inside, they immediately noticed the changes. "What happened here?" the first dwarf wondered aloud. The dwarfs began to look around the house one by one. The first dwarf noticed his small chair and exclaimed, "Who sat in my chair?" The cushion was slightly pressed, and it was not as neatly arranged as usual. Next, the second dwarf looked at the table with a surprised expression. "Who ate from my plate?" he asked. There were clear signs that someone had eaten from the table. Small pieces of bread were scattered, and the fork and knife were slightly out of place. The third dwarf found crumbs and shouted, "Who ate my bread?" His voice was filled with surprise and confusion. The fourth dwarf, hearing this, looked at his plate and also cried out, "Who ate my vegetables?" His plate clearly showed signs that someone had eaten from it. The fifth dwarf was astonished to find his fork had been used. "Who used my fork?" he asked, holding it up and looking around. The sixth dwarf noticed that his knife was not in its usual spot and said, "Who moved my knife?" Finally, the seventh dwarf pointed to his cup and said, "Who used my cup?" There were drops of wine left in the cup. The seven dwarfs looked at each other in confusion. Who could have come into our house, they wondered, trying to figure out the situation. The dwarfs walked around the house, trying to find clues about who had used their belongings. They examined the food, the dishes, and the small traces left around the house, realizing that someone had indeed entered and used their things. As the dwarfs looked around in confusion, the first dwarf pointed to his bed and exclaimed, "Who stepped on my bed?" There were small footprints clearly visible on the bed. The other dwarfs checked their beds, and each one showed signs that someone had lain in them. The dwarfs were even more astonished. Who could have come into our house, they wondered. They carefully followed the clues left around the house. As they traced the footprints, they finally found Snow White sleeping deeply in the smallest bed. Snow White was peacefully asleep, her face showing signs of exhaustion. The dwarfs were filled with surprise and curiosity, quietly observing her. In the silence of the night, the seven dwarfs carefully looked at their new guest, wondering who she was and where she came from. They exchanged looks, trying not to wake her. Snow White's beauty and peaceful appearance captivated their hearts. Late at night, the seven dwarfs watched their new guest carefully. Still astonished, they whispered among themselves about how such a beautiful girl could be sleeping so peacefully. "She is so pretty," the first dwarf whispered. "Where could she have come from?" the second dwarf wondered. The seventh dwarf cautiously approached and gently shone his lamp on her forehead. The soft light from the small lamp lit up Snow White's face. Her skin was as white as snow, and her lips were as red as roses. The seventh dwarf signaled the others, who all held up their lamps and quietly surrounded her, admiring her beauty. "Goodness! What a beautiful girl!" the dwarfs whispered excitedly. Their voices were filled with wonder and admiration as they gazed at Snow White's beauty. The dwarfs were delighted but let her continue sleeping undisturbed. "She must be so tired," the first dwarf whispered. "We must protect her," the second dwarf agreed. The seventh dwarf took turns sleeping in each of the other dwarfs' beds, moving from one to the next each hour. He did this to keep watch over Snow White and ensure she remained safe. As he moved from bed to bed, time passed and morning arrived. The dwarfs watched over Snow White as the morning sun began to shine into the house. Her face was relaxed with a peaceful smile. The dwarfs felt warmth in their hearts as they saw her sleeping so peacefully. A new morning dawned. The sun's gentle rays streamed through the window, waking Snow White. As she opened her eyes, she was startled to see the 7 dwarfs surrounding her, watching her with curious eyes. "Hello, what's your name?" the first dwarf asked kindly. His eyes were gentle and friendly. Snow White, momentarily surprised, soon smiled and answered, "I am Snow White." Her voice was soft and sweet. The second dwarf stepped forward cautiously and asked, "How did you come into our house?" His voice was filled with curiosity. The dwarfs were eager to hear Snow White's story. Snow White took a deep breath and began her tale. "I was driven out of the kingdom," Snow White said with a sad expression. "My stepmother wanted to kill me because she thought I was more beautiful than her. She ordered the huntsman to do it. But the huntsman spared me and helped me escape into the forest." The dwarfs listened intently to Snow White's story, feeling sympathy and sometimes admiration. As Snow White calmly shared her hardships, the dwarfs' hearts began to open up to her. They deeply empathized with the difficulties and pain she had endured. By the end of her story, the dwarf's eyes were filled with warmth. "You've been through so much," the first dwarf said. "We will protect you," the second dwarf added. Their voices were full of sincerity. The dwarf's trust and compassion for Snow White grew. Her pure and warm heart moved them, and they felt a strong desire to protect her. "You will stay with us now," the third dwarf said. "We will keep you safe," the fourth dwarf agreed. "Can you take care of our home? Cooking, cleaning, washing, sewing, and embroidery. If you can keep the house neat and tidy, you can stay with us. We can provide everything you need," the first dwarf said warmly and earnestly. The other dwarfs nodded in agreement. "And don't worry too much. We will help you," the second dwarf added. The dwarfs promised not to leave all the work to Snow White alone. Snow White thought deeply about their offer. She felt relieved that she could stay safely in the dwarf's house and receive their help. "Yes, I will help with all the work I can," she answered with a smile. The dwarfs were delighted that Snow White accepted their offer. "That's great. From now on, we are family," the third dwarf said. "Together, we can handle everything," the fourth dwarf agreed. After Snow White started living with the seven dwarfs, her daily life changed completely. In the mornings, Snow White prepared a warm breakfast for the dwarfs before they left for work. She hummed happily as she cooked delicious meals in the kitchen, her clear, beautiful voice filling the house. The kitchen was filled with the sweet smell of bread and the fresh scent of fruit. Snow White carefully prepared the food with a happy smile. "What should I make today?" she wondered softly as she chose fresh ingredients. When the dwarfs gathered for breakfast, they marveled at her cooking skills and enjoyed the meal happily. "Snow White, your cooking is wonderful," the first dwarf said. The second dwarf nodded in agreement. "Yes, it's such a joy to have a delicious breakfast every day." Snow White felt joy seeing the dwarfs enjoy the food. "I'm glad you like it," she said with a bright smile. The dwarfs appreciated her warm heart and dedication. After breakfast, the dwarfs set off to work, and Snow White waved them goodbye. "Have a great day," she called cheerfully. During the day, Snow White took care of the house chores. She was responsible for cleaning, washing, sewing, and other tasks. The house was always clean and tidy. Snow White dusted and cleaned every corner, making everything sparkle. At first, everything was new and unfamiliar, but the dwarfs patiently taught her how to do each task. The first dwarf showed her how to clean, the second taught her how to do laundry, and the third explained how to sew and embroider. With the dwarf's help, Snow White learned step by step. "So this is how it's done," she said confidently as she worked. The dwarfs were pleased to see her doing well. "Well done, Snow White," the fourth dwarf praised her. Snow White smiled happily at their compliments. As they worked together, Snow White and the dwarfs grew closer, building a strong bond. They helped and learned from each other, growing even closer. Snow White felt like the dwarfs were her family. "Thanks to you all, I'm really happy," she said warmly. The dwarfs also felt great satisfaction living with Snow White. "We enjoy spending time with you," the fifth dwarf said. Snow White and the dwarfs supported each other and cherished each day together. Snow White became more accustomed to life in the dwarf's house. Every evening, she prepared a delicious dinner for them when they returned from work. Her cooking skills improved daily, and the dwarfs eagerly anticipated her hearty meals. In the evenings, Snow White worked hard in the kitchen, using fresh ingredients to prepare meals with care. "What should I make for dinner tonight?" she wondered aloud, thinking of the dwarf's favorite dishes. Her face always radiated a smile. When the dwarfs came home, Snow White greeted them with a warm smile. "Welcome home. Dinner is ready," she said brightly. The dwarfs, tired from the day's work, felt their fatigue melt away as they enjoyed the meal Snow White had prepared. "Snow White, your cooking is amazing," the first dwarf said. "All the day's tiredness disappears," the second dwarf agreed, nodding. The dwarfs enjoyed their dinner, admiring her cooking skills. Snow White felt joy seeing the dwarfs enjoy the food. "I'm glad you like it," she said warmly. After dinner, the dwarfs expressed their gratitude to Snow White. "Thank you so much, Snow White." "Thanks to you, we are happy every day," the third dwarf said. The third dwarf said, "Snow White, since you came, our house has become much brighter." The other dwarfs nodded in agreement. "Yes, Snow White, thanks to you, our home is much happier," the fourth dwarf added. All the dwarfs loved listening to Snow White's songs and stories. Her voice was clear and beautiful, and whenever she told a story, everyone listened attentively. In the evenings, they gathered in the living room to hear her tales or sing together, enjoying their time. Snow White shared various stories with the dwarfs. "What story would you like to hear today?" she asked. The dwarfs excitedly replied. "Tell us a story from the kingdom," the first dwarf said. "No, tell us a new story," the second dwarf said eagerly. Snow White smiled and began her story. She talked about her experiences in the kingdom, beautiful landscapes, and the adventures of brave knights. The dwarfs were engrossed in her tales. "What a wonderful story," the third dwarf said in admiration. After the stories, Snow White sang with the dwarfs. Her songs brought warmth to the house, and the dwarfs happily joined in. "Snow White, your singing is beautiful," the fourth dwarf said. "Thank you for bringing us such joy," the fifth dwarf added. Snow White and the seven dwarfs spent their days helping each other and laughing together. They cherished each other's company and always enjoyed their time together. Snow White expressed her gratitude whenever the dwarfs helped with household chores. "Thank you so much. Everything is easier because of you," she said with a smile. The dwarfs also felt deeply grateful for everything Snow White did for them. "Snow White, our lives are much happier because of you," the first dwarf said. "Yes, you always brighten our home," the second dwarf added. Their home was always filled with laughter and joy. In the mornings, they enjoyed breakfast together, starting their day on a happy note. During the day, they helped each other with their tasks, and in the evenings, they gathered to share a meal and sing songs, enjoying each other's company. Snow White expressed her deep gratitude to the dwarfs, who had become her new family. She was touched by their kindness and felt blessed to live with them. "Thanks to all of you, I have found happiness again." "Thank you so much," she said sincerely. Snow White cherished every day, grateful for her life with the dwarfs. She valued every moment spent with them and was content with their shared life. The dwarfs also cherished their time with Snow White, feeling joyful that she had become a part of their family. However, her days were not just filled with routine. Snow White found great joy in interacting with the animals of the forest. The animals warmly welcomed her, and Snow White formed special friendships with them. When she went into the forest, little birds perched on her shoulder and sang. "Hello, little friends," Snow White greeted them with a smile. Squirrels and rabbits played around her, and she enjoyed their company. "What shall we play today?" she asked, spending happy moments with the animals. In the forest, Snow White met new friends. The birds gathered at her window, chirping along to her songs. Snow White's voice was clear and beautiful, and the birds joyfully responded to her singing. "Hello, little birds," Snow White greeted them with a smile. Various animals from the forest visited Snow White, responding to her call. Especially, the little rabbits and squirrels often stayed near her while she worked in the garden. "Do you want to help?" she asked with a smile. The rabbits and squirrels moved energetically, as if answering her question. While working in the garden, Snow White felt great happiness spending time with the animals. She talked with them and smiled, watching them enjoy themselves. "What song should we sing today?" she asked softly, starting a new song. The birds added beautiful melodies to her song, and the squirrels and rabbits danced around her. Snow White treasured the time spent with the animals, feeling the peace and happiness of nature. But the 7 dwarfs were worried about her safety. They constantly feared something might happen to Snow White while she was alone. One evening, the dwarfs seriously warned her. "Your stepmother might find out where you are soon," the first dwarf said, his voice full of concern. Never open the door to anyone, the second dwarf added. The dwarfs warned Snow White not to open the door to any strangers. You are safe with us, but you must be careful when we are not here, the third dwarf said. Your stepmother is very cunning and wicked. Always be on guard so she doesn't find you, the fourth dwarf added. Snow White listened to the dwarf's warnings with a worried expression. I understand. I will remember your words. I will never open the door to strangers, she replied seriously. The dwarfs felt reassured by Snow White's determination and sighed in relief. We will protect you, Snow White, the fifth dwarf said. But you must always be careful, the sixth dwarf added. The queen walked into a grandly decorated room within her castle. The room was filled with ornate decorations, and a large chandelier was shining brightly. Beautiful paintings adorned the walls, and in the center of the room stood the queen's treasured magic mirror. Standing before the mirror, the queen looked at her reflection and spoke. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? Her voice was cold and confident. She asked this question regularly, and the mirror always replied that she was the fairest. This time, too, the queen expected to hear the same answer. She stared at the mirror with a smug expression, waiting for the response. The room fell silent, and the mirror began to shine as it answered the queen's question. However, the mirror's answer was not what she expected. Queen, you are the fairest here, but beyond the mountains with the 7 dwarfs lives Snow White, who is 1,000 times more beautiful than you. The queen's face turned pale, and she was shocked. Knowing that the mirror always spoke the truth, she realized that the huntsman had deceived her and that Snow White was still alive. Overwhelmed with anger and shock, the queen began to ponder how to permanently eliminate Snow White. The huntsman tricked me. Snow White is still alive. The queen muttered through clenched teeth. Her heart was filled with jealousy and rage. I must get rid of her, the queen resolved. The queen's face twisted with anger. She couldn't believe the mirror's words. Snow White is still alive. Consumed by rage, she trembled as she glared at the mirror. Her eyes blazed with jealousy. The queen thought to herself, I must be the fairest woman in this land. Snow White must be eliminated. Her jealousy and anger grew, and she could no longer contain them. She began to devise a plan to permanently remove Snow White. The queen fell into deep thought, determined to succeed this time. She started crafting a more cunning and evil plan than before. Pacing around the room, she imagined various schemes. This time, I won't fail. Snow White, you will never be the fairest in this land. After much deliberation, the queen devised the perfect plan. This time, she decided to disguise herself so thoroughly that no one would recognize her. She sat before the mirror and began to cast a spell. Deep wrinkles appeared on her face, and her hair turned white. Her hands became wrinkled and rough like those of an old woman who had lived many years. She donned tattered clothes, transforming completely into an old peddler woman. No one would recognize her as the queen. Once her disguise was complete, the queen loaded a cart with various trinkets. She filled it with colorful silk ribbons, sparkling glass beads, and all sorts of goods. "This time, I will succeed," she whispered to herself. The queen set off, crossing 7 mountains and trudging through the dense forest. Despite the steep paths and thick woods, her mind was solely focused on eliminating Snow White. After a long journey, she finally reached the small house where the 7 dwarfs lived. Reaching the little house, the queen parked her cart and knocked on the door. "Fine wares for sale," she called out in the voice of an old peddler. Snow White peered out from the window, curious. "Hello. What are you selling?" she asked, her eyes full of curiosity. The queen responded in a kind voice, "I have good quality, beautiful items. I even have colorful ribbons." She pulled out a shiny, colorful silk ribbon from her cart. The ribbon sparkled in the light, looking as beautiful as a rainbow. Snow White's eyes lit up. "It's so pretty," she exclaimed. The queen seized the opportunity. "This ribbon would be perfect for someone as beautiful as you. Come closer and have a look." Snow White was captivated by the ribbon's beauty. "It's really lovely," she murmured, debating whether to open the door. But the queen's kind words and the beautiful ribbon broke down her caution. Entranced by the glittering ribbon, Snow White opened the door. She invited the disguised queen inside. "Come in. The ribbon is so pretty." The queen smiled inwardly as she entered the house. "This ribbon will make you look even more beautiful. Let me tie it for you," she said sweetly. Snow White stood before the queen without any suspicion, letting her tie the new ribbon around her waist. The queen skillfully tied the silk ribbon around Snow White's waist. "The color is so lovely. It matches your skin perfectly," she said, tightening the ribbon. Snow White admired herself in the mirror. "It's really beautiful," she said, feeling pleased as the queen continued to tie the ribbon. The queen tightened the ribbon more and more. "It needs to be tighter to look perfect," she said. The queen took advantage of Snow White's trust, swiftly tightening the ribbon further. As the ribbon tightened, Snow White's face turned pale, and she struggled to breathe. Snow White quickly became unable to breathe and collapsed to the floor. Her vision darkened, and she lay there motionless as if she were dead. Her hands weakly grasped at the ribbon around her waist, but she couldn't muster the strength to loosen it. Believing her plan had succeeded perfectly, the queen left the house. She made her way out of the forest and down the steep mountain path, her heart filled with a sense of victory and satisfaction. Confident that Snow White would no longer pose a threat, she walked briskly through the forest. As the queen walked through the sunlit forest, with birds chirping and the wind rustling the leaves, she was lost in her thoughts. "Now, I am the fairest in this land," she whispered to herself. The darkness of the forest gradually lifted as the queen hurried back to her castle. She was filled with the confidence that nothing would disturb her now. She believed that once she stood before her mirror again, it would confirm her as the fairest. Not once did the queen look back as she left the forest. She was certain Snow White could not survive. The queen, savoring her victory, returned to her castle. As dusk fell and the forest began to darken, the 7 dwarfs returned home, exhausted from their day's work. Covered in dust from the mines, they encouraged each other as they made their way back. As soon as they stepped over the threshold of their little house, they sensed something was wrong. Snow White, who usually greeted them with a bright smile, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the house was filled with an eerie silence, and a sense of foreboding weighed heavily on the dwarfs' hearts. They began searching the house for Snow White. "Here she is! Snow White is here!" one dwarf shouted. The dwarfs rushed to where the voice came from and found Snow White lying on the floor. She was motionless, looking as if she were dead. Her face was pale, and her lips had turned blue. The dwarfs were overcome with shock and fear. "Snow White! What happened?" they cried, trying to shake her awake, but she didn't move. Desperation filled their faces as they looked at each other, unsure of what to do. "Someone must have done something to her," one dwarf exclaimed. "What happened while we were away?" another dwarf asked worriedly, looking around. The dwarfs couldn't understand why Snow White was in this state. Overwhelmed with fear, the dwarfs carefully examined Snow White. They checked her face and hands, trying to find any sign of what might be wrong. One dwarf then noticed the tightly bound ribbon around her waist. "Look at this ribbon. It's tied too tightly," he exclaimed. The other dwarfs saw the ribbon and were equally puzzled. "It seems like she couldn't breathe because of it," another dwarf said. The dwarfs quickly fetched a sharp knife to cut the ribbon. The most skillful dwarf carefully cut through the ribbon. As soon as it was loosened, Snow White took a deep breath and began to move. Her face started to regain its color, and the dwarfs sighed with relief. "She's breathing." "Cutting the ribbon worked," one dwarf said joyfully. The others were relieved to hear this. Snow White slowly regained consciousness. She blinked and saw the dwarfs surrounding her. Once Snow White fully regained consciousness, the dwarfs gathered around and asked her what had happened. Snow White began to explain slowly. "This morning, an old woman came to the house selling beautiful silk ribbons. They were so pretty that I opened the door for her," Snow White said with a trembling voice. "The old woman said she could tie the ribbon more beautifully for me, and without any suspicion, I let her." Snow White continued, holding back tears. "But the old woman tied the ribbon too tightly. I couldn't breathe and collapsed to the floor." That old peddler woman must be the evil queen in disguise. Be careful and don't let anyone into the house, especially when we are not here, the dwarfs warned sternly. Their voices were filled with deep concern and anger. Hearing the dwarfs' words, Snow White reflected deeply and resolved to be more cautious. "I will never open the door again. No matter how kind they seem, I won't trust strangers," she said firmly. This experience taught Snow White a valuable lesson. She realized that her carelessness had almost put her in great danger. She decided never to trust strangers again. Snow White took the dwarf's advice to heart, determined not to fall for the queen's tricks again. Snow White thanked the dwarfs for their help and expressed her gratitude once more. The dwarfs vowed to protect her and took even more care to ensure her safety. Returning home, the queen quickly made her way to her room. She stood before the mirror with great anticipation, once again asking, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror answered as the queen had expected. "Queen, you are the fairest here, but beyond the mountains with the 7 dwarfs lives Snow White, who is 1,000 times more beautiful than you." The queen's face twisted with rage upon hearing these words. Her eyes blazed with fury, and her hands trembled. "Snow White again," she shouted, glaring at the mirror. Her heart was filled with intense emotions. "Snow White is still alive," she paced the room in anger and despair. "But this time, I will find a way to finish her off for good," the queen muttered, vowing revenge. The queen decided to use an even more cunning method this time. She entered her magical chamber and began casting a powerful spell. Dark light emitted from her fingertips, and the queen used the forces of darkness to create a special item. This time, she made a poisoned comb. The comb was beautiful and intricately designed, looking like a jeweled ornament. But it hid a deadly poison. The queen planned to use this comb to harm Snow White once more. Holding the comb in her hand, the queen thought about how the poison would work, smiling with satisfaction. This comb is not just for tidying hair. As soon as it touches Snow White's scalp, she will collapse instantly, the queen whispered to herself. The queen, reflecting on her past failures, resolved never to repeat the same mistakes. She prepared an even more cunning disguise using her magic. This time, she decided to transform into a completely different old woman. Sitting before the mirror, she began altering her appearance. Her wrinkles deepened, and her hair turned a mottled gray. Her hands became rough and wrinkled, resembling those of an old hag. She donned even more tattered clothes, completing her transformation. The queen now looked like an entirely different old woman, unrecognizable. She took the poisoned comb and set out once more, crossing the 7 mountains to reach the 7 dwarfs' house. As she traversed the treacherous mountain paths, she assured herself that this plan was flawless. Despite concerns that Snow White might not open the door to strangers again, she was confident in her success. Arriving at the small house deep in the forest, the queen paused to catch her breath and review her plan. "I won't fail this time," she whispered. Standing before the house, she called out in her old woman's voice, "Beautiful combs for sale." Inside the house, Snow White hesitated for a moment as she heard the voice. She remembered the dwarf's warning to never let strangers in. However, there was something special about the old woman's voice that piqued Snow White's curiosity. Peering cautiously out the window, Snow White responded, "Just move along. I can't let anyone inside." Her voice was filled with caution. But the queen did not give up. With a cunning smile, she tried to entice Snow White's curiosity. "Just take a look," the queen said, pulling out a glittering object from her cart. It was the poisoned comb, sparkling with a beautiful shine as it caught the sunlight. "This comb is truly beautiful. Just look at it," the queen said, holding the comb up so that Snow White could see it clearly. The comb glittered like a jewel, and Snow White's heart wavered at its beauty. She tried to remain cautious, but the allure of the comb drew her to open the window a bit more. "It really is beautiful," she whispered. The queen seized the moment. "Just touch it once. It's so smooth and lovely," she said in a friendly voice, continuing to captivate Snow White's curiosity. Despite her hesitation, Snow White's heart began to open up to the queen's persuasion. Snow White was swayed by the beauty of the comb. The sparkling comb was truly captivating, and she eventually opened the door. The queen smiled inwardly, speaking kindly, "Let me comb your hair nicely for you." Snow White took the old woman's hand without suspicion. "Thank you so much," she said, leaning her head forward. The queen, eagerly anticipating this moment, placed the comb in Snow White's hair and began to comb it slowly. The queen, eager, began to comb Snow White's hair gently. As the comb glided through her hair, Snow White felt the soft touch and smiled. "It feels really nice." The queen, with practiced kindness, continued combing her hair. As the queen continued to comb Snow White's hair, the poison from the comb began to spread through her scalp. Snow White quickly felt dizzy, her vision blurring. She reached for her head, swaying, before collapsing to the floor, unconscious. "Your beauty ends here," the queen whispered coldly, her smile filled with satisfaction. Certain that Snow White would not awaken again, the queen left, disappearing into the forest. The house grew silent once more as Snow White lay motionless on the floor. The queen's wicked plan appeared successful, as Snow White's face turned pale and her body grew cold. The wicked queen, confident in her victory, exited the forest, certain that Snow White would not wake again. Her heart was filled with joy and satisfaction. On her way back to the castle, she couldn't help but smile, believing she had finally triumphed. The queen arrived at the castle with a cold smile, heading straight to her room. She was filled with certainty that she was now the most beautiful queen without needing to ask the mirror. Standing before the mirror, she gazed at herself and murmured once more, "Now, I am the most beautiful person in this kingdom." This time, the queen was truly convinced that Snow White would never rise again. Her heart was free from fear and anxiety. All that remained was for her to revel in her beauty and power. The small house where Snow White lay fell silent once more. Until the dwarfs returned, Snow White lay motionless on the cold floor. In the evening, the 7 dwarfs returned home from work. They entered the house, tired from their day at the mine. Immediately, they sensed something was wrong. The house was unusually quiet, and Snow White did not greet them as she usually did. The dwarfs, filled with unease, searched the house. One of them found Snow White lying on the floor. "Here! Snow White is here!" he shouted. The other dwarfs rushed over. Snow White looked as if she were dead, her face pale and her breath shallow. The dwarfs were overcome with fear and shock as they approached her, trying to understand what had happened. One dwarf noticed the sparkling comb in her hair. "What is this?" he asked, carefully removing the comb. It still had traces of poison, the cause of Snow White's condition. As the dwarf carefully removed the poisoned comb, Snow White slowly began to regain consciousness. Her face regained some color, and she opened her eyes, taking a deep breath. The dwarf sighed with relief, watching over Snow White. "Are you all right?" one dwarf asked gently. Snow White nodded weakly, saying, "Yes, I'm all right. Let me tell you what happened." Snow White recounted the events, explaining how the queen, disguised as an old woman, had come again. This morning, the queen disguised herself as an old woman and sold beautiful combs. "I opened the door because the comb was so beautiful," she said, her voice trembling. The dwarfs were horrified after hearing Snow White's story. "The queen again! How terrible!" one dwarf exclaimed in anger. The others nodded in agreement. "We must be extremely cautious this time. Never let a stranger into the house," another dwarf warned. Snow White bowed her head and took the dwarf's words to heart. "Yes, I will never open the door. No matter how kind they seem or how beautiful the items they bring, I will never open it," she promised. Meanwhile, the queen returned to her room in the castle. Standing before the mirror, she smiled, thinking of her accomplishments. Confident she was now the fairest, she asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror replied without hesitation, "Queen, you are the fairest here, but beyond the mountains with the 7 dwarfs lives Snow White, who is 1,000 times more beautiful than you." The queen's face contorted with rage. Her hands trembled with fury, and her eyes burned with anger. "Snow White is still alive," she shouted, glaring at the mirror. Consumed with anger, the queen paced the room, overwhelmed by intense emotions. "I thought I would end her for sure this time," she clenched her fists and ground her teeth. The queen's heart burned with hatred and jealousy towards Snow White. "This time, I will succeed. Snow White, you will never survive again," the queen muttered to herself with determination. She began to devise another plan. This time, she intended to eliminate Snow White in a more cunning and certain way. The queen fueled her anger and obsession even more, starting to devise a new plan to completely get rid of Snow White. The queen, filled with a fierce determination, began to devise a more devious plan. She searched her library for an ancient book of dark magic filled with the most powerful and dangerous spells. She was prepared to use any means necessary to eliminate Snow White. The queen rummaged through her bookshelf and pulled out an old book filled with dark magic. This book contained the most powerful and dangerous spells. She was ready to use this magic to completely eliminate Snow White. Her obsession and jealousy had already surpassed all limits, and now the queen was prepared to do anything. The queen devised an even more meticulous plan this time. She prepared a cleverly concealed poisoned apple that no one would suspect. In a secret room within the castle, unknown to anyone, she began executing her scheme. The queen used a particularly strong poison to create the apple. This poison was so potent that a single bite could be fatal. She handled the poisoned apple with great care, ensuring that the entire process remained completely secret. The finished apple looked more tempting than any other apple. It had a perfect red hue and an alluring shine, making anyone crave a bite. The apple glistened like a jewel when it caught the light. However, inside, it was filled with deadly poison. "This apple will get rid of Snow White forever," the queen whispered to herself. She held the apple in her hand, gazing at it with satisfaction. Her eyes gleamed with determination, certain that this time she would not fail. The queen disguised herself as a farmer's wife this time. She added wrinkles to her face and donned ragged clothes. Holding the poisoned apple, she set out once more, crossing the 7 mountains to reach the 7 dwarfs' house. She was filled with confidence that this plan would succeed. After crossing 7 mountains, the queen, disguised as an old woman, arrived at the dwarf's small house. She knocked on the door and called out, "Apples for sale. Delicious apples." Her voice sounded kind and gentle. Snow White initially refused the apple. "Thank you, but I can't accept anything from anyone," she said cautiously. The queen, persistent, suggested, worried it might be poisoned. "Let's cut the apple in half. You can have the red side, and I'll eat the white side." Skillfully, the queen cut the apple. She pretended to eat the safe white part while offering the red poison part to Snow White. "See, I ate the white part, and I'm fine," the queen said with a smile. Snow White felt reassured as she watched the queen, disguised as an old woman, eat the apple with apparent enjoyment. "It really is safe," she said, feeling relieved. Snow White took the poisoned half of the apple and took a bite. As the sweet taste spread through her mouth, Snow White suddenly felt dizzy. Her face turned pale, and she dropped the apple. Within moments, she collapsed to the floor, unconscious. The queen, satisfied, whispered coldly, "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony. This time, the dwarfs won't be able to wake you." Her voice was filled with triumph. Certain of her victory, the queen returned home. She quickly went to her room, standing before the mirror. Believing everything had gone as planned, she asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" This time, the mirror responded as the queen desired. "Queen, you are the fairest in the land." The queen heard those words and smiled with satisfaction. She was filled with joy and contentment that the mirror finally declared her the most beautiful. "Now I am truly the most beautiful queen," she whispered to herself. She reveled in her victory, convinced that Snow White would no longer pose a threat to her. The queen felt reassured of her beauty and power, finding a deep sense of relief within. "Now, there is no one in this land more beautiful than I," she told herself once more. The queen ended her day in joy and satisfaction. She was intoxicated by her victory, ready to spend a peaceful night free of fear and anxiety. She believed that Snow White would no longer threaten her beauty, and that she would remain the most beautiful queen in the land. The 7 dwarfs returned home in the evening. Entering the house, they immediately sensed something was wrong. The house was unusually quiet, and Snow White did not greet them as usual. "Snow White!" cried the first dwarf. At that moment, they found her lying on the floor. She was not breathing at all and looked peaceful, as if in an eternal sleep. The dwarfs were overcome with shock and sadness. "Snow White! What happened?" They rushed to her side. Her face was pale, and her body was cold. The dwarfs did everything they could to revive her. They tried giving her water and warming her body, but all their efforts were in vain. Snow White showed no signs of life. "This can't be." "Snow White," one dwarf said in a sorrowful voice. The others, too, wept as they watched over her. They desperately hoped she would wake up again, but she remained still. One by one, the dwarfs sank to the floor in grief. They were engulfed by the sorrow of losing Snow White, finding it hard to accept that she would never wake up again. How could this happen? They muttered, their tears flowing silently. The dwarfs gathered around the fallen Snow White, engulfed in deep sorrow. They looked at her with hearts full of grief. After silently watching over her for a while, the dwarfs began to discuss plans for her burial. However, when they looked closely at Snow White's face, they were struck with astonishment. Her face still looked full of life. Her cheeks were tinged with a rosy blush, as if she were still alive. "We can't bury such a beautiful princess in the dark ground," one dwarf said. The other dwarfs nodded in agreement. "We can't just bury Snow White in the ground. We need to keep her beauty preserved," another dwarf said. After deep deliberation, the dwarfs decided to place Snow White in a brighter and more peaceful resting place. Eventually, the dwarfs decided to create a glass coffin for Snow White. They wanted to honor her beauty forever by making the most special coffin. This glass coffin was made entirely of transparent glass, allowing anyone passing by to see the princess's beauty. The dwarfs painstakingly crafted the glass coffin for Snow White. They found the clearest and most transparent glass in the forest and carefully pieced it together. Every part of the coffin shone with transparency, reflecting Snow White's peaceful appearance. On the completed glass coffin, they engraved Snow White's name in golden letters. The name Snow White gleamed, reminding everyone that she was the daughter of a king. Through this special coffin, the dwarfs wanted to show that Snow White was still a respected and loved figure. Snow White lay peacefully inside the glass coffin. Her face still looked full of life, and her cheeks were tinged with a rosy blush. The dwarfs watched over her beauty, believing they had done the best they could for her. After placing Snow White in the glass coffin, the dwarfs moved it to a serene spot on the mountain. It was a beautiful place where the sunlight gently shone and flowers bloomed. It was the most peaceful place where Snow White could rest comfortably. The dwarfs never left her side and kept watch over her. Every morning and evening, they stood by Snow White, honoring her beauty with prayers. They brought flowers for her and kept her glass coffin clean at all times. Snow White remained in the glass coffin, unchanged over time. Her skin was still as white as snow, her lips as red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. She lay peacefully as if in an eternal sleep. All the creatures of the forest honored Snow White's peaceful rest by watching over her. Little birds flew around the glass coffin, singing beautiful songs. Deer and rabbits quietly grazed near the coffin, keeping her company. Owls, crows, pigeons, and all the forest animals remembered Snow White's beauty and mourned for her. They watched over her eternal sleep with respect and love, cherishing her kindness and beauty. Snow White lay unchanged in the glass coffin. The dwarfs and all the creatures of the forest kept their love and sorrow for her, watching over her peaceful sleep. One day, a prince wandered into the forest. After finishing a hunt, he lost his way and arrived at the dwarf's house. The dwarfs welcomed the prince warmly. Grateful for their hospitality, the prince listened to their story. The next morning, the prince accompanied the dwarfs to the serene spot on the mountain. There, he saw the beautiful Snow White lying in the glass coffin. Her face still looked full of life, and her cheeks were tinged with a rosy blush. The prince was deeply moved by Snow White's beauty. He read the golden letters engraved on the glass coffin. The name Snow White shone, reminding him that she was the daughter of a king. The prince couldn't take his eyes off Snow White and felt that losing her would be unbearable. The prince pleaded with the dwarfs, "Please give me the coffin. I will give you anything you desire." He promised to cherish Snow White. But the dwarfs firmly replied, "Even if you offered all the gold in the world, we would not part with this coffin." Hearing the prince's earnest plea, the dwarfs hesitated. They loved Snow White like family and couldn't imagine giving her to anyone else. Snow White was the center of their lives, and protecting her was their most important duty. We love Snow White dearly. We can't imagine giving her to anyone else, one dwarf said sadly. The other dwarfs nodded in agreement. But the prince didn't give up. With heartfelt emotion, he pleaded again. Please understand how much I cherish Snow White. I truly love and will protect her. I cannot live without her. The prince's eyes were filled with sincerity, and his voice trembled with earnestness. The dwarfs could sense his deep affection and intention to protect Snow White. If you truly love and can protect her, we will send her with you, the dwarfs finally decided. They carefully entrusted the glass coffin containing Snow White to the prince. The prince thanked the dwarfs deeply and gently accepted Snow White. Thank you. I will cherish Snow White forever and do my best for her, the prince said sincerely. The dwarfs felt assured that the prince would protect Snow White and handed over the glass coffin. They reminisced about their time with Snow White and prayed earnestly for her happiness and safety. The prince instructed his attendants to carry the coffin on their shoulders. They carefully moved the glass coffin containing Snow White and headed for the castle. The prince ensured Snow White would safely arrive at the castle. However, during the journey, an accident occurred when the attendants tripped over a bush. They lost their balance and the coffin shook violently. At that moment, the piece of poisoned apple stuck in Snow White's throat dislodged. Suddenly, a bit of life returned to Snow White's face. She slowly opened her eyes and took a deep breath. The attendants were filled with amazement and joy at the sight. When the piece of apple came out and Snow White miraculously awoke, the prince couldn't hide his tears of joy and relief. Snow White initially looked around in bewilderment. "Oh my, where am I?" she asked with a confused expression. The prince gazed at her tenderly and answered gently, "You are with me. Don't worry, you are safe now." He warmly held her hand, reassuring her. Snow White, still confused, looked around. She tried to comprehend her situation, having awakened inside a glass coffin. "What happened?" she asked the prince. The prince explained everything that had happened to Snow White. "Your stepmother tried to harm you with a poisoned apple. But the dwarfs protected you, and I came to save you." He told her about receiving the coffin from the dwarfs and what happened on the way back to the castle. As the prince explained, Snow White slowly began to understand what she had been through. She felt deeply grateful to the prince and the dwarfs for saving her. "Thank you so much. Because of you, I could wake up again." She sincerely expressed her gratitude to the prince. The prince smiled warmly at Snow White. "Everything is going to be all right now. You are safe. I will protect you," he promised her. With a heartfelt expression, the prince proposed to Snow White. "I cherish you more than anything in this world. Come with me to my father's castle. Be my wife," he said, his voice filled with sincerity and love. Snow White's heart warmed as she listened to the prince's sincere words. Looking into his earnest eyes, she felt his love. Snow White gladly accepted the prince's proposal. "Yes, I love you too. Let's go together," she answered with a smile. The two left for the prince's kingdom, promising a future filled with love and happiness. They thanked the dwarfs and bid them farewell. The dwarfs blessed the couple, wishing them a life full of happiness. The prince ensured Snow White's safety and happiness as he took her to his kingdom. Throughout the journey back to the castle, they held each other's hands tightly, discussing the future they would share. The wedding at the prince's castle was grand and splendid. The castle was beautifully decorated, and the entire kingdom was filled with joy and celebration. The king, queen, and all the people of the kingdom gathered to celebrate the union of the prince and Snow White. Guests from far and wide attended the wedding. Kings and queens from neighboring kingdoms, nobles, and even common folk came to celebrate the marriage of Snow White and the prince. The castle, adorned with beautiful flowers and decorations, looked like a scene from a dream. Snow White wore a dazzlingly beautiful dress, and the prince was dressed in splendid attire. They walked into the wedding hall, gazing at each other with smiles full of love and happiness. Their love moved everyone gathered in the castle. Songs and dances of celebration continued through the night. Musicians played beautiful melodies, and dancers performed splendidly. The guests sang and danced together, exchanging words of congratulations. The castle was filled with laughter and joy. The evil stepmother was also invited to the wedding. She still hadn't let go of her obsession with her beauty. To attend the wedding, she dressed in the most splendid and beautiful attire and stood before her mirror. She wanted to confirm her beauty once again. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" she asked as she always did. Her voice still carried confidence and arrogance. The mirror answered without hesitation, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true. But the new queen, Snow White, is 1,000 times fairer than you." The stepmother's face froze instantly upon hearing this. Her heart filled with jealousy and anger once again. The new queen, Snow White, she muttered through gritted teeth. She wanted to believe she was more beautiful than Snow White, but the mirror always told the truth. The stepmother found it hard to accept that she was no longer the fairest of them all. Consumed by jealousy and anger, she couldn't avoid attending the wedding. Despite wearing a beautiful dress, her heart was filled with dark shadows. The evil queen cursed and headed towards the wedding hall. She didn't want to accept her defeat, nor could she tolerate Snow White becoming the queen. When she entered the wedding hall, the queen recognized Snow White standing before her. Snow White was shining with beauty and happiness. At that moment, the queen froze with fear and dread. She could no longer maintain her beauty and couldn't accept that Snow White was now the true queen. Filled with jealousy and anger, the queen hurled curses. "How can you be more beautiful than me? You will never be happy." Her voice trembled with rage. She didn't know what to do, overcome with fear, and continued spewing curses. At that moment, the servants appeared with tongs. They placed iron shoes over a coal fire until they were red hot. The servants then brought the red-hot shoes and placed them before the queen. "You must now wear these shoes," the servants said coldly. Terrified, the queen resisted but was ultimately forced to wear the red-hot shoes. As soon as she put them on, she writhed in pain and began to dance uncontrollably. She couldn't stop and continued to dance until she collapsed and died. Snow White and the prince watched as the evil queen met her end. With all the evil gone, they were free to share their love and live happily. Snow White and the prince found true love and happiness, and their kingdom experienced everlasting peace.